Here's another element from Papa's collection, silicon. Okay, silicon is over here on the periodic table. It's element 14. And notice it's right below carbon. It has a lot of similarities with carbon. Carbon, you can make a lot of different molecules of different shapes. You can have a whole lot of very complicated bonds. Silicon is a lot like it. So it's going to be a very useful molecule, or a very useful atom for making large complicated molecules. Silicon also, though, has an interesting property. Notice these elements up here are what are called nonmetals. They don't conduct electricity, and you can't beat them into different shapes. You can't bend them like you can with a metal. Down here, these are the metals, and these are things that can conduct electricity, and you can also make them into different shapes. Okay, but notice this one. Silicon is right on the boundary between being a metal and a nonmetal. So is aluminum. Aluminum is definitely a metal, but it does have some of the properties of nonmetals. Silicon is a nonmetal, but it does have some properties similar to metals. I've got a bigger piece of silicon here. Hopefully you'll be able to see this well. You notice, nice and shiny, and it is possible to get this to conduct electricity. Notice it looks like a metal, but it's actually very brittle. If I was to put a hammer to this, it would shatter, it wouldn't bend. So it definitely has some of the properties of metals, but some of the properties of nonmetals. And so some people will call it a metalloid, just to say it's kind of on the border. Well, one of the things about that you can use about silicon is that you can change its properties by adding some other atoms with it. For example, if you were to mix silicon with a little phosphorus, you're going to get something that will have a few extra electrons and actually can be sort of a source of electrons. If you mix it with something like boron or gallium, you're going to have something that'll attract electrons. And you can actually use that in a device like this. This is a calculator, but up at the top here we've got a solar cell. This is mostly silicon, but it has some things in it so that you can force an electron to jump from one part of this to another if you shine light on it. And it'll absorb that energy from the light and use it to conduct electricity. So this is a source of energy that's found in a solar cell. And if I didn't have pure silicon for my element collection, I'd just take a solar cell out of one of my dead calculators, and I would use it to because that's mostly silicon. Now notice also calculators have little chips inside of them that have basically a whole lot of switches, and you can use silicon as a way of either switching electric circuit on or off. And if you want to do calculations, one of the things that's useful is to have a whole bunch of switches. So we've got these little tiny switches in here that allow us to be able to do calculations and other things like that. So inside of a calculator or a lot of electronic parts, you will often find silicon. Now I'll go ahead and mention also that silicon can be used to make a lot of other useful things. If you mix it with if you react it with oxygen, you can produce quartz and ultimately things like glass. Now, sand on the beach is mostly silicon and oxygen bonded together, and so beach sand can be used as a source of silicon. A lot of rocks will contain a lot of silicon. Now, the other thing is we can stick it with some carbon and some other organic molecules, and we can produce some organosilicon compounds that can have some interesting properties. One of them is a long string of silicon, carbon, and a bunch of other elements, long, thin molecules that will produce a very thick liquid that is called silly putty. Silly actually describes what you do with silly putty, but the silly from silly putty is actually short for silicon, because that's found in it. Okay, I'll also mention that sometimes silicon is used in medicine. We'll notice that there is a molecule called simethicone, which is used in some products like Gas X and other things that help you to burp. So, silicon, it helps us calculate things, it provides us energy, and it helps us burp.